Arcowhip is going to be defending the position that farming bivalves is unethical, and Vohan is going to be taking the position that it is ethical to farm and consume bivalves. We'll decide a winner upon who concedes. If no one concedes, we'll put it to a voting poll in which the audience votes on who had the better argumentation, who performed better in the debate, and who opposed the opposition better. You guys will have 40 minutes starting now, and you can get started.
Okay. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So as Stone said, I'm taking the position that bivalves are unethical. And I just want to point out that both myself and the interlocutor, Vohan, is a vegan, so we share a lot of the same sentiments about caring for animals. What's really interesting about this debate is if bivalves deserve moral consideration, because there's this huge question mark over whether they're sentient or not. They're very, very primitive organisms. They're very simple, and a lot of people consider them to be something like an animal that really is just a plant, the same kind of level of sentience with a plant. I don't think that's the case with bivalves. I think bivalves are sentient, although it's very, very primitive and compared to what we have. One of the reasons why I think that they're sentient is they can move very small amounts. They can move to different areas that they want to attach to. If the water flow changes and they want to have more access to the current, they can move their body so they can open up and filter more efficiently. They have these sensor response where if there's a shadow, they detect the light of a shadow like a prey animal, then they'll close their shell. They also have pain receptors. And there was a study done on blue mussels where they took blue mussels that were in room temperature, and then they were put in really cold water. And when they did that, they measured the opiate responses, and the opiate responses were similar to ones that mammals get whenever they are induced with stress, and the opiates are flushed through the body to kind of calm the stress down and make the animal feel better. It's a part of stress management. So we see that they have thermal stress that occurs. We also see that they have pain responses when you cut them. So this is more advanced than something like a plant might have. And I think that this very primitive movement shows that the bivalve has enough sentience to be given some type of moral consideration. I wouldn't give it the same as, like, say, a cow, maybe, but I do think it deserves enough so that we don't harvest it and eat it. In part because the way to cook it is to boil it alive. You have to cook it a lot, like with the shell closed, so that way you know that it doesn't cause any food poisoning. So you boil it alive to make sure that it's safe to eat. So all of these creatures that are killed are being killed while they're still alive and experiencing pain. The other thing I want to talk about is the environmental impact. If we farm bivalves, there's going to be a huge aquaculture endeavor that takes place. And because bivalves are filter animals, they've changed the nutrient profile of the water dramatically. And when that happens, the plants in that environment are impacted. Like, you'll see a decrease in seagrass, which other fish eat, which changes the whole system of animals eating each other that occurs and just knocks the ecosystem out of balance. We see this as a big problem in the Chesapeake Bay area, where we overfished oysters, and doing the opposite, where we add many more oysters to a system to harvest and eat, would also impact the environment in the same type of way, where it changes the entire cascade. And this is especially problematic in a time where sea level temperatures are rising around the world, and it's already impacting the amount of fish in an area and the amount of seaweed in an area, which is already impacting things like endangered bird numbers. We see this with fish populations collapsing, with herring and things like that. So if we add this other human element, we're just going to rapidly increase the environmental impact. And so those are my two main reasons why I think farming bivalves is unethical.
Okay. So I first want to go through them one by one if I can remember them. The first point you mentioned that bivalves move about to get to places. I mean, this can be easily put down to stimuli, right? Because, for example, when we know that they move, but we also know that they only move due to basis of things around them, right? So, like heat, they have a heat. They have a stimuli to heat. That means they'll open up their shell when it's hot. Now that isn't any indicant. That doesn't tell me like this thing's sentient. That just tells me that this thing responds to certain environmental factors. And I think all the examples you gave when you first started could all be just easily done down to stimuli.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I don't think just because it's a stimuli, it means it's not. I mean, a stimuli response means that it's not sentient. Like, for example, we have a stimuli response in the human body. Like our pupils will dilate just based on the light in the room. And we can experience that dilation, but we have no choice in it. There's no control there or intention.
Well, wait a minute. When you say experience it, you don't actually experience anything unless you're looking in a mirror and looking at it happening. You don't actually know it's happening.
Well, you can. I don't know about you, but like if I look at the sun, the way that my vision is impacted changes, and that light, that change of how I see things in the world is because of the pupil changing size.
No,
like it changes the amount of light.
No, it's because the sun's blinding your eyes. It's not because it's making the chemical response of the dilution in your eyes. You're not feeling that. You're feeling the sun.
Well, that's what I mean. Like the dilution in the eyes, that's happening physically, but I do see a change. So even though I'm having this stimuli response, I'm still experiencing a change. Now, you might say, well, we have a brain that's very complicated, so we would experience a change like that, but the muscle doesn't.
Right.
And I think
what I would say.
Yeah. But I think that every human response that we have is just a type of stimuli response anyways. So I don't see the difference between a stimuli response in a primitive animal versus a stimuli response in the human animal. It's just more complicated in the human.
Well, if it hasn't got a brain, which we know bivalves don't have, it can't process anything.
Yeah,
you can't conceptualize on these sort of things.
I don't think it needs to conceptualize something to be sentient. And I think that even though it doesn't have a localized brain like we do, I think the brain types of things would be inside the body. Like there are neurons in it, like that are perceiving pain and stimuli responses. So even though it's not localized, there could still be sentience there. It's just that the whole body becomes the brain.
But I think that's probably very wishy-washy, right? In the science community, saying, well, if the being feels pain, therefore it must be sentient, because that doesn't even make any sense. Because why would it even evolve to feel pain without sentience? Like, what is the goal of feeling pain? Right? It's to learn, isn't it? So you haven't got a brain. Why would you feel pain?
I mean, I think pain is an animal's way to like have the animal move in a certain way to like get out of danger or to seek out things that are beneficial to the animal to survive. So even though like it doesn't have this localized brain, the body itself would function like a brain, and it would have these pain responses, and it would try to move away from the pain response, or it would open up towards the temperature change, things like that. So there's this primitive form of action that the animal can take, and the ability to take that action requires sentience, in my opinion.
Right. So you do actually think they're sentient.
In a very primitive way, yeah.
In a very primitive way. They haven't got a central nervous system or brain, but you think they're sentient because they can react to things.
Not just because they can react to things, but the way they can react to things. Because, like, you know, other plants can react to things, but this animal can move. It can react and relocate. And the ability to move, I think, is something that requires something like a primitive sentience.
You know, it's not glued to the floor like a plant is. You know? I don't think that's much of a point.
It can glue itself to the floor, though. It can put cement itself there and break it.
Just because it can move, that doesn't tell us anything. That just tells us it can move, and that could be based on, you know, just chemical responses in it.
Yeah, but I think that our sentience is chemical responses too. So
but we have a brain. We're conscious, right? The question is, are they conscious? I don't think they are conscious without a brain or a central nervous system to respond to things.
I mean, they have the same. So there's a type of cell called it's a ganglia cell, which is the type of cell we have for volitional movement. So in our body, the cells that are responsible for the movement we do by choice is in the oyster as well. That same cell. So if the choice firing neuron requires the ability to make the choice, then the oyster has that ability. So even if it's a chemical response, again, the choice firing is a chemical response for humans too. There's this experiment where they saw deep inside the brain, the neurons would get ready to fire. And then once we were conscious of it, which happened after the neurons were ready to fire, then it would fire. So some people say that experiment points out that we don't have a choice, ultimately, that there's a chemical response there. But regardless, the point is that choice firing mechanism is a chemical response for the oyster, just like it is for the human. And in both cases, it requires some type of like volition. It's a volitional cell. So the body can function like a brain, even if it doesn't have the same structure as the human brain. I don't think it's required that all sentient beings have the same structure as a human brain.
Oh, no, I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is just because it's having chemical responses. You brought up an example there where we have the same sort of cell, and then people looked at a brain to see what was going on. Well, that's it, isn't it? We looked at the brain to see what was going on inside. They don't have brains, so you can't just say, well, they do these sort of things and we have this sort of things. But what we don't have in common is the most essential thing that we can all agree on, which requires sentience, right? Full-fledged consciousness.
Yeah, well, I get what you're saying. I'm saying that the body of the oyster becomes the brain. So that
sounds pseudo-y to me, that one. That doesn't sound real.
Why doesn't it sound real?
You say, yeah, they don't have a brain, but their entire body becomes the brain. I mean, do you think they have thoughts? Do you think they think? They have feelings? They, desires? Any of this?
I think that they have like a will to do certain things. I don't think that they have feelings. Like, I don't think they get
Where's the will coming from, though, if they don't have a brain?
Well, again, I don't think they have a localized brain, but the body functions like a brain. And also, there are parts of our body that have, like, there are sort of pain-like receptors in the body that are similar to receptors in the brain. So our body has a brain-like aspect anyways. It's just it transfers information into the brain where it's more localized. But in the oyster, these cells that are in there would just be held in the whole body. Yeah. It's like so small that the most efficient way for that creature to have any kind of sentience would be for that body to be the brain.
Right, yeah, but we know of smaller things that do have brains and are sentient, like certain insects and stuff that are much smaller than bivalves. What was I going to say? Oh, yeah, so if they... I don't think that they can feel pain. And the reason is because because they don't have brain. Basically, they're not sentient. And if a creature would to feel pain, they would therefore need to be evolved to be sentient as well. And I think the science literature, the most of the literature is on my side saying, yeah, they're not sentient. And I think there's a reason for that.
Well, what is there? I haven't found many studies on it, on if they have sentience or not. Seems to me an under-researched field. And we aren't totally convinced how we would even measure sentience in an animal. There are people who are arguing that the way we, like, for example, there are some neuroscientists who say fish aren't sentient, even though they have a brain. So just having a brain isn't even agreed upon in the scientific community for it having sentience. So you and I accept that fish have sentience because we see the brain and we see that they have these behaviors and they have like physical responses to things in the environment. What changes for the oyster from like fish, for example, is that there isn't this localized brain. There still is the pain receptors. There is this ability to move towards other things, and there are these behaviors. We haven't done any tests to see if they can learn, but there are some examples of behavior changing based on different things in the environment. So, for example, mussels that live in an area where there are a lot more predators have much harder shells. They've calcified their shells to be stronger, and they've made their connections to the ground a lot stronger.
I just showed that up to natural selection. Those oysters or those bivalves in that particular area, the ones that survived were the ones that had the harder shells. That's why you get oysters or bivalves in that particular area with harder shells, because the ones that didn't have the harder shells were eaten.
But that's in one estuary. So it's like in one area those have stronger shells and stronger bottoms, and then in another area where there's less predators in the same bay, they don't have that same behavior. So it's not just
maybe from
behavior change.
Yeah, maybe those two different bivalve groups are from two different lineages.
Well, they're the same species. Like
same species, but let's just say over a period of time, one part of the pond or lake was more dangerous than the other part. They were all the same species at one point.
Yeah,
and then natural selection took over.
Well, they can move. They can move to that other area, and the way that they procreate is they basically like launch sperm and eggs into the water, and then once there's this little like sort of baby version that swims to certain areas, and then it will start to make its shell, or it'll attach to something. Like in the oyster case, it attaches to older shells and then starts to build up around it. So it's not going to stay localized in the same water. It'll move to different parts of the water, trying to find a place where it can live. And we see this behavior change based on the environment around it. So there's like a type of learning that takes place, I think.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't. I think that's a bit of a stretch saying that they're learning. I mean, it could just be like they're just swimming around aimlessly. And I suspect that's probably the reason. That's probably what you're seeing. And I don't even think they're aware what they're doing. I don't even think they're aware that they're moving. I just think they're moving because of stimuli. So they'll have little sensors, right? So they'll have like little sensors, and it'll say like, "Oh, this water is like not the right type of water. It's too cold." Or let's go this way and see what's this way, right? And it's not even that complex. It's just this is just snip snap chemical responses doing it.
Right, but then we're back to the same infinite regress of like it's just chemical responses for every animal, even the ones that have a sense of agency.
The difference is the brain, right? That's what I'm saying. That's
and we're back at the same thing where it doesn't need to be a localized brain in order for there to be sentience.
Have you got any sort of evidence to say like bivalves use their entire body like the brain? Because I'd be interested in seeing that.
No, I mean it's a deductive argument. It's not that there's not evidence that it is being used like a brain, but the evidence is no evidence. Cells. Right? No, there's some. The evidence is sort of a combination of things. One is the types of cells that are in there are the types of cells that are in brains, one of which is that voluntary movement cell that requires something to be voluntary. The other is this aspect of response to the environment that is similar to animals that has sentience. So if you take the behavior and you take this primitive structure, it's reasonable to assume that the bivalve has a primitive form of sentience. They're not aware like a cow is. They don't have feelings like depression or something like that, but they have an awareness.
What sort of awareness are we looking at? So I definitely agree that they're not aware as a cow. I would just take it one step further and say they're just as aware as my tomato plant in my garden.
Yeah, but your plant in your garden doesn't have a volitional cell. It doesn't have a cell that requires voluntary action.
See, but that cell could just be like a bygone part of its evolution, right? Because we've got cells in our body that are dormant because of, just because we haven't needed them. There's genetic code in our bodies to grow like giant tails and all sorts of stuff that we just don't have, that we just don't use currently. So I would suspect that these cells, these remnants of what you could say, well, what we use this cell in our body for this. With them, it's obviously just been evolutioned out of no need for it.
That voluntary cell is the cell that they use in order to move to a different place, in order to open their shell when the temperature changes or when they want to release their reproduction stuff.
That's just based on stimuli, like heat stimuli.
Of course, it's based on a stimuli. But again, my point is that, one, that volitionary cell is not vestigial. It's used in their behavior. And two, it's back to chemical responses and stimuli responses. Everything that we do, even the most sentient being we know, is just chemical responses and stimuli responses. It's way more complex, though.
Right, because we've got brains, and they don't.
Yeah, and then we're back to the same thing about, like, a localized brain versus the body functioning like a brain. It doesn't have to be a brain as we recognize it, but it can be another type of brain. But, at this point, I think we're kind of going around a little bit in circles, so maybe we should move on to the environment.
Sure. So you mentioned that they were bad for the environment. I think that's probably the opposite. Mussels can be sustainably farmed. They help clean the water from toxins. Places that grow mussels have higher biodiversity. I know you said something contradictory before to that, but from what I've seen, that does. And they're much more sustainable. They're much better for humans than other foods because we don't have to use pesticides or anything like that. So if you grow mussels, like rope-grown mussels, not wild ones, you can increase biodiversity in places where you grow them. It will actually clean toxins from the water, which will help the fish and all other animals in that area. And they have an extremely low carbon footprint, one of the lowest. If this is classed as an animal product, that might be just whatever you want to class it as. But for an animal product, they have probably the lowest carbon footprint out of all.
Yeah, I agree with you. They have a very low carbon footprint. I also agree with you that the direct crop deaths or bikills would be low. So on those 2 points, we agree. Where we disagree is with the impact in the environment otherwise. Like, for example, you said that they clean the water, and they do clean the water, but when they clean the water, they change the nutrient profile of the water, which the plants need to survive. So, for example, in Humboldt Bay, California, they built an oyster farm. And in order to build the oyster farm, first of all, you have to set up a barrier around it so that predators aren't going to get in there and kill it. So it requires a bunch of this structure to be made. And then that structure is already damaging the seagrass around it. And then it protects the oysters that are in there. So now that you have that, the oysters that are in there start to filter all the water. And when they do that, it changes the amount of nutrients that are available for the other seagrass in the water to eat. And then that deplenishes. And once that happens, then the fish that eat that seagrass, their population goes down. And then the birds that eat those fish, they don't have anything to eat in that area where they've migrated to that bay, for generation after generation after generation every year. That's where they go eat on their stop down south. And they're going to have less food there. They're going to struggle to continue their path down. This is going to impact the crabs, all the fish, all the birds in that area, and it's going to impact the plankton.
Just don't grow them where there's seagrass grows.
Where would you grow them then? They require a certain type of water environment that is like brackish. You can't like grow them in a lake,
I'm sure there's solutions around it. I don't think saying, just because they're bad for like this one, Nordic plant, that it's going to be bad all around. There's going to be pros to cons. I think the cleaning of toxins in the water is probably going to have a lot of benefits as well. And I think those benefits are probably going to outweigh, this very obscure situation you've put forward.
Well, it's not. I don't think it's that obscure because it's the type of seagrass that herring eat, and herring are really important for the whole ecosystem in the ocean. It's not just it's not going to be localized to the bay because other bigger fish eat the herring too. And herring populations have already been overfished. So this population that's overfished and it's already causing this struggle on the whole ecosystem chain would have even less fish there. It would be another mechanism for depleting the herring population. And that's just one animal that's impacted by it, which has this huge scale across the entire range of animals that use the ocean to survive. Another thing, do you want to respond to that before I go to the second point?
Say that again, sorry.
Would you like to respond to that before I move on to a point?
Can you say that point again?
Just that herring eat these seagrasses that require a certain type of nutrient profile. And when you have more oysters and things there, it filters the water, so it's so clean that the seagrass can't eat. There's nothing for the seagrass to eat, so there's less seagrass. That seagrass is the food for the herring. The herring is positioned in a place where it's important for a lot of larger animals, and those larger animals are important for a lot of the population management in the ocean. So it's like if you kill the thing that the herring eats, it would be like killing the grass that the elk eat in Yellowstone National Park, which would have impacts across the entire biodome. All the animals and all the plants would be impacted by a reduction in sort of central animal.
Yeah, my response to that is don't grow them where seagrass is. Be more responsible when you grow them. Check the seagrass, and if the seagrass is not getting the nutrients it needs, you could just add some more dirt or whatever they thingy. Job done.
Well, there's a certain type of environment that these oysters are required to grow in, and they need certain nutrients too. And a lot of the ocean is basically a desert. There are certain areas where there is this rich profile of nutrients, and in those places we see a lot of marine life pop up. But in between those areas, it's more dead than it is alive, and so it's difficult to find these places where we could grow it, and it would be enough for those animals to survive without it having this impact.
Yeah, so you brought one example of this seagrass, right?
Yeah.
But bivalves actually increase biodiversity on other aspects. So for example, they may take the nutrients that this seagrass uses or whatever, but then, it could help other plant life that these other fish and other things that eat. by increasing the biodiversity of the local area, and we know that they do this.
How do we know that?
It's recorded.
Where? Because whatever I was sort of looking it up, what I was finding was this sort of trophic cascade that occurs.
Well, I haven't got it on hand. But yeah, I mean, I thought it was. I mean, I've heard of mussels and other stuff increase biodiversity ages ago.
So maybe we're getting a little confused on. So perhaps mussels that naturally occur in an ecosystem increase biodiversity. So it's important to keep those mussel populations healthy. What I'm saying is if we change that dynamic and add a whole bunch of farming, that would disrupt it. So I'm not saying like mussels in all contexts would destroy biodiversity. So maybe you're right that like from some respects, yes, mussels already in an environment that is sort of already in its motion, that would be essential for the biodiversity there. They would rely on the mussels to survive. The plants would rely on But when we farm, we're going to add a bunch more mussels to the water. So much so it's going to drastically change the nutrient profile.
Right. So another way you could combat that is just wall it off. Right. So we grow them on ropes, usually dangle them into water or whatever. So then you would just wall them off so they have their own little environment, so they don't affect the local wildlife. If that's the case, there's many ways we could solve that problem.
It won't change the oysters can't be walled off because they need nutrients to eat. So they would need some flow from the outside environment, and you couldn't.
You could fix that as well by just taking some of the water out periodically and adding water from the outside.
Sort of flushing in and out. Well, there's another problem, which is when you do things like that, you change the deposits of the sediment in the water, and you have these buildups of sand that occur. So in France, we saw this happen. They were farming mussels, and they were doing sort of what you were describing. Like they had these nets, these cages that the oysters were in. They'd put them down. They tried to block it off. And then we saw all of these, there's soil and silt in the water that would attach to these other things, and it would build up. And it would make it harder for these other plants that would have grown there. So even outside of it, we still have the same problem where the silt is building up. It's changing the flow dynamics. And by changing the flow dynamics, it's changing where the plants can grow, which is impacting the environment where these animals are eating and they're birthing their children and things like that. It ends up still having this impact on the environment.
I don't see how it would. For example, in my scenario where I said we'd wall it off, and we would you wouldn't even have to flush it out, right? You wouldn't have to be flushed out around the surrounding area. I mean, you could just take the water out, dump it anywhere down the drain, and then go somewhere up water somewhere up on the shore, gets water far away, and then put it back in, and there'd be none of that then as well.
Wait, say that again? So you're basically saying like build an estuary that's separate?
I'm not even saying that. I'm saying like, let's just say you were growing a bunch of mussels at the bottom of a pier head, right? You'd wall off the pier head so then it has its own environment.
Mm-hmm.
If the water requires new nutrients, you could just simply put it in. If it requires old nutrients or whatever to be took out, you just take them out and then put more water in. It doesn't seem like much of a problem to me.
Well, the problem is what happens around it. So that wall that you put up.
Yeah.
That wall that you put up. Well, first of all, the oysters need a brackish environment. They can't be in the ocean. It needs to be somewhat salty and somewhat fresh water. So in between. So there's a very narrow range of where it can be. Within that range, the water usually is flowing from like a river into the ocean. And those flow dynamics are very important for the health of that estuary. When you build a wall around something, you change the flow dynamics. Sediment will build up on the wall because the flow is going out to the ocean. That sediment that builds up on the wall is something that the grass on the other side of the wall would eat. So then you create a shadow. That grass can't eat. that creates a little desert inside that estuary that used to be rich, but now will be a little bit dead. The same thing will happen where that sand that's collecting will be less for the other parts of the estuary as well. And as it changes the flow dynamic, it will change where these grasses can grow. When you change where this grasses grow in the flow dynamics, it will change the shape of the beach, which will change the other parts of the land around it. So it would be one thing to have a really tiny farm where it's already going to have this impact. It'd be another thing to try and scale up this massive oyster farming thing so that we could replace animal agriculture with it. So as you scale up something like oyster farming to replace animal products or crop products...
Sneaking in a dodgy premise there. I never said we should replace it with the current meat demand or anything like that.
I thought you said in the beginning that it would be better to eat the bivalves rather than the crop deaths that occur.
I didn't say that, no.
You didn't say that it would be better for the impact of crop deaths to switch to bivalves instead?
No.
Oh, well then why do you think it's ethical?
Oh, because they're not sentient.
Yeah, but there's this huge impact on the environment. So the crop deaths have no weight for you in it being more ethical.
Crop deaths. In general agriculture, animal agriculture.
Yeah, I was under the understanding that you said in the beginning that one of the reasons why it's ethical to eat bivalves is it would be like a relief valve for the crop deaths that occur on land. And because these aren't sentient, it would be better to eat them rather than eat crops that contribute to the deaths of sentient animals.
I didn't say nothing of the sort.
Okay. I guess I'll have to listen to the recording again. At any rate, there is a scalability problem where if this tiny thing maybe is manageable, but in terms of feeding a large population, there's this big issue of how it will impact the estuary, which has this other cascade effect.
I'm not convinced that we couldn't just farm them on land. Obviously not on land, but underwater on land, and just make a artificial environment for them that's perfect for them. I'm pretty sure that's in our capability to do such a thing, regardless if we want.
Yeah, we have built these little farms for them, but the aquaculture impact on the total environment is bad for the reasons I've already talked about, where it changes the sediment flow of the river, which changes the shape, which changes where the plants grow. It reduces the plant growth that occurs, which reduces the fish population.
I disagree. I think it increases the biodiversity. But anyway, we're ending in a minute. So I just want to put forward. I've got a quick lesson in evolution, right? The only reason why creatures evolve to feel pain is if they're sentient. If they weren't sentient, they wouldn't evolve to feel pain. And I think it's pretty in the consensus that these don't feel pain. These bivalves don't feel pain. And the reason it'd be weird for them to feel pain and then not have brains is because it'd be an absolute waste of energy to do so. And it'd be no benefit as well, because why would you want something? Why would you evolve to feel pain without a brain to know what's going on? All it would be like a negative, like I don't even know how to explain how pain receptors would work without a consciousness to conceive that information.
Yeah, I mean, they do have pain receptors, and they also have the cell that is the same cell we use for voluntary movement.
I know, but I don't understand how that works without a brain. I don't understand why it would work. I don't understand how it would work.
Right, but I agree with your premise.
I don't think you do either.
I agree with your premise that if an animal has a pain receptor, that it wouldn't make sense it would have the pain receptor if there wasn't sentience there. This animal has a pain receptor. So even though I don't see the same structures, it doesn't make logical sense to me that there would be a pain receptor without a way to perceive it. There's a function there that require some type of sentience. And I think the bivalves demonstrate
evolutionary bygone trait.
Well, even sentience for us is an evolutionary bygone trait.
Well, what I mean by that is it's no longer needed, right? I mean, it's something that they had. Maybe they have the blueprint and certain genetic codes in them to developed into sentient creatures.
Right.
But it never happened.
So you think that it stopped short and then it's just there as Yeah. Well, but they use these things. They use both the pain receptors in their life and the voluntary muscle cells to seek out different parts where they can stay and live. They can open their shell whenever the temperature changes. Even though it's a response, everything we do is a chemical response. So just because it's a chemical response doesn't mean that there's no sentience there. And these cells are firing and the animal is moving and behaving. We can see this movement. We can see their behavior adapt for different types of circumstances in the environment. It's primitive. It's very primitive. I don't think it's the same level as like animals on land, but I do think that they have sentience.
Yeah, it's about as complicated as some plants. I'd argue that some plants have much more complicated movements and actions and behaviors than bivalves. I mean, some plants, can do loads of different things, loads more complicated things than bivalves. I mean, I can't think of any on top of the head, but I think we all know this. I mean,
I understand that point. I would say that in the plant case, it's not an individual plant that makes something complicated, but it's a forest. So when you take trees together that work as a network, they behave in a similar way that a bivalve might.
Right.
They can't move, but it's not the tree that's sentient. It's maybe the forest. So I would accept an argument that the forest is sentient or that a collection of mushrooms is sentient, but not a mushroom, not a single tree. In the case of the bivalve, it's all contained in that one creature. So when you have this cell that's important for voluntary movement inside this animal, but you don't have any cells that are responsible for voluntary movement in the plant, it seems to me that it's a strong indicator that there's a difference between the oyster with that type of cell versus the plant that just has a response.
Of course there's a difference, right? I mean, we're talking about two completely different separate species that have evolved to do different things. But what we can say is we know that one probably isn't sentient, and we know that one probably isn't sentient either. And what we're going on is this how we know that we're sentient, which is minds, brains, consciousness, and we know that both plants and mussels lack these sort of things because they don't have what they need to be sentient.
I think I agree with you. They don't have a localized brain like what we usually see in sentient animals. Where I disagree is that because they don't have a localized brain, they're not sentient, because the body can function like a localized brain, even though it's spread out.
I mean, let's take the human gut, for example, right? The human gut, it's like its own organism on its own, right? It does things. It has loads of bacteria in it. It's like its own organism, right? But it's not.
And it influences our mind, yeah.
That's because it's got a mind. Yeah, that's because it's got a mind connected to it, a brain connected to it. Oysters don't, or not maybe not. I mean, bivalves in general just don't.
But that doesn't mean. Yeah, do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first?
I'll go first, since though you started the debate first. Okay, so what I will say is, I don't think bivalves are sentient. I think if they were sentient, they would have a much more complex system in place, like we see with other sentient creatures, like a central nervous system and a brain, to take in the outside factors like pain and danger and basic things that basic sentient creatures have. They have none of this. They move about, but are they really moving about? I mean, yeah, they are moving, but it's due to stimuli, obviously. It's not due to a chemical impulse, a consciousness saying, let's go over there, that'll be nice. They just go over there without even thinking, because it's just chemical responses without a brain thinking, consciousness telling it to experience something better over there. That's not happening. It would be an absolute waste of energy for it to experience pain without a mind. Therefore, I don't think it experiences pain at all. What I do think, though, is the reason why we see certain things in it, like certain cells and other things that we have, and we can say, well, we use this cell for that, and they have that same cell, is just evolutionary traits, in the closet, so to speak. It's not come through the same way we've got blueprints in our genes to do, grow into dinosaurs. Maybe, I don't know. Well, we've got the genetic blueprints in us to, whatever. Same with them, but they don't use it because they haven't got a brain. Thank you. That's my closing statement.
Well, do you want to make a closing statement about the environmental impact? Because I'm going to mention that in mine.
Yeah, I think given the fact that they have an extremely low carbon footprint, given the fact that humans are incredibly smart, and there may be certain problems that arise from traditional ways of farming mussels and the like, because we're so smart, we can just come by them. So any sort of argument can be easily swept aside with 10 minutes of thinking. Really, it's not a big deal. But we also, considering that there's no pesticides in them, that they do help clean toxins from water. I know you had a point about that could be negative, and I can see that might be negative, but then again, we can just sidestep all those arguments by saying we can just figure it out. And it wouldn't take a genius to figure this out.
Thanks, Vohan.
And also, they're an incredibly good source of B12.
They are a really good source of B12. That is true. And protein. They're very rich in those things. So I'll start by saying where I agree with Vohan. I agree that they're a great source of B12. I agree that they have a lot of protein. I agree that in a natural environment, bivalves can increase biodiversity. Where I disagree is when we change the environment to suit our needs, like with something like farming, where we would add many more oysters, mussels, all of these things that we would eat, that would change the nutrient profile of the water. Because, as Vohan pointed out, they're filter feeders. They clean the water. That's how they survive. If you add many more cleaners to the water, you're going to get way cleaner water. That dirtiness in the water, something we call dirt, is food for the plants that live in that water, like the seagrass. That seagrass is food for the herring. That herring is food for sharks, tuna, birds, humans, all kinds of other animals that rely on those animals to survive. These herring are so important to the multiple ecosystems in the ocean. They're already being depleted by human overfishing. They're already being depleted by climate change and sea temperature rise. The addition of their food source being depleted because we want to eat oysters would have catastrophic effects across multiple ecosystems in the ocean. So the environmental impact from that alone would be, I think, catastrophic. Second, I think it would be a problem for the health of the estuary in general, because when you build these farms, it changes the way that the silt is going to the ocean. And so you get buildups around the farms. It changes the flow. And as you change the flow, it changes where the grass grows. So then you start to have these impacts for other smaller things. And the birds that live only in that estuary would have trouble finding food because their food source would be depleted, and they would have trouble reproducing. So the health of an estuary would go down locally, and then the health of the ocean would go down in a global sense. So from those environmental aspects, I think there's harm being done, even if its carbon impact would be low. To the sentience argument, I agree that the bivalve does not have a localized brain. Where I disagree is that a localized brain is required for sentience. With the bivalve, the body could function like a brain. There are pain receptors in the bivalve. Those pain receptors are used for the bivalve to move, to seek out water that's more comfortable, to avoid a predator. Like if there's a shadow above, they'll close their shell. There are also the cells that are the same for humans that are responsible for voluntary movement. And I want to emphasize that point. These are the cells that we associate with voluntary movement. There's a type of volition. And Vohan made the point, well, it's just a chemical response. But I would say in the human, the voluntary movement is also a chemical response. So just because it's a chemical response doesn't mean that there is no awareness there. And I agree that having pain is something useful for a sentient animal to survive. We see the pain in the bivalve. I agree that voluntary movement is useful for an animal to survive. We see that in the bivalve. So even though we don't see a brain like we do in a fish or a human, it doesn't mean that there isn't sentience there. And I think from an ethical point of view, we have a duty to not consume these animals for our needs out of a precaution for their sentience or potential sentience for those who are still skeptical. And we have a duty for the environment not to eat these bivalves and create this catastrophic cascade in local and global environments. And those are my closing statements.
Okay, sweet. Thank you guys. And for the audience listening, I put in a voting poll in the debate chat text channel. So, as I said before, please base your vote on who you think performed better in the debate and who had the better argumentation. And thank you guys for debating. Really appreciate it.
Vohan, thank you very much.
No, thank you. It was fun trying to, defend positions you don't particularly hold.
I